As the sun slowly sank behind the suburban skyline, I heard the sound of tires rumbling in the driveway. This early, I wasn't expecting anyone. Warm and steady, my husband's voice echoed from the corridor.
He was not by himself.
As I turned the corner after wiping my hands on the kitchen towel, I was momentarily stopped by the sight of a younger man with dark hair that was tousled and a casual smile. My husband congratulated his nephew and replied, "It's been too long. He'll be staying with us for a while." The nephew, slightly taller, more animated and radiating that certain carefree energy I hadn't felt in years, looked at me with a smile that bordered on charming but never crossed into arrogance. The conversation flowed easily over dinner. They spoke of old memories, fishing trips, college stories, and shared jokes I didn't understand. But I noticed how his eyes flitted toward me occasionally, not lingering too long, but enough to make my pulse flicker. My husband remained oblivious, engrossed in recounting stories. I smiled, sipped my wine, and pushed away a thought that felt out of place. When the plates were cleared and the night wound down, I retreated to the terrace to savor the cooling breeze. Moments later, I heard the soft click of the patio door. It was him. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, keeping my gaze on the fading sky. He shrugged, stepping beside me.
"Just wanted some air."
The silence between us felt charged, like static before a storm. I felt conscious of every move, how my fingers tapped the glass, how the night air grazed my bare shoulders. He glanced sideways. "You seem different from what I remember." I let out a small laugh. "People change, not always for the worse," he replied, his voice low but deliberate. The words settled between us, like embers waiting for a gust. I turned to face him fully for the first time that evening. There was something in his expression, not flirtation, not arrogance, but a recognition. It wasn't the kind of look that expected anything. Simply said, "I see you." Before I could respond, the patio door slid open again. My husband leaned out, cheerfully unaware of the strange undercurrent between us. "Everything okay?" "Fine," I replied quickly. Too quickly. The nephew stretched, feigning nonchalance. "Yeah, just needed some air," the moment shattered, replaced by ordinary small talk as we all headed back inside. But something had shifted, like the faint crackle of a lit fuse. As I lay in bed that night, the usual comfort of my husband's presence felt more distant than ever. And as much as I hated admitting it to myself, my mind drifted back to that quiet moment outside. The morning started like any other, a calm hum of routine. I brewed coffee, savoring its familiar aroma as I leaned against the counter, still lost in the remnants of last night. When the sound of footsteps approached, I half expected my husband. But it was him. Barefoot, hair tousled, his t-shirt slightly wrinkled. "Morning." His voice was raspy from sleep. "Coffee?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral as I reached for another mug. "Thanks." He smiled, his eyes lingering as I poured. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable.
He
stood close enough that I could feel his presence, a quiet energy that unsettled me. When he reached for the mug, our fingers brushed, an innocent touch that sent a wave of heat up my arm.
"Did you sleep well?"
I asked, desperate to fill the silence. He sipped the coffee slowly, his gaze steady.
"Yeah."
Though it's strange being back. Everything looks the same, but it feels different. I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. Life has a way of doing that. We heard the familiar thud of the front door as my husband left for work, calling out a distracted
"Goodbye."
The house felt quieter, too quiet. "I should get going," I mumbled, brushing past him as casually as I could. But later that day, fate played its hand again. The gym was supposed to be my sanctuary, my hour of solitude, where I could lose myself in movement and breath. But as I adjusted the weights on the machine, I heard a voice behind me that sent a jolt of surprise down my spine. "Didn't expect to see you here." I turned and there he was, casual, confident, a towel slung over one shoulder. "It's a small town," I replied, trying for a smile. "Or maybe it's destiny," he joked, his grin playful. I laughed despite myself.
There was something disarming about him.
He wasn't trying too hard, he didn't need to. We moved through the gym in parallel, exchanging light banter between sets. He was different here, focused, composed, yet still carrying that effortless charm. "Do you always come alone?" he asked, wiping his face with a towel. I hesitated before answering. "Yeah, it's my time to unwind." "Interesting," he murmured, as if filing that detail away. As I reached for my bag, the strap slipped, and everything tumbled to the floor. My keys, water bottle, phone. He was beside me in an instant, kneeling to help. Our hands collided again as we both reached for the same item.
"Second time today," he said.
His voice soft but meaningful. I froze, feeling the weight of his gaze. Time slowed as we both stayed there, inches apart. My pulse quickened, and for a fleeting second, the world narrowed to just this. His face close to mine, his breath steady while mine felt shallow and uneven. Then, as if some invisible line had been crossed, I felt his hand brush against mine again, slower this time. Before I knew it, his face leaned ever so slightly toward mine. And then, it was as if the air itself shattered. His lips found mine in a way that wasn't sudden, but inevitable. Soft, searching, yet restrained, but just as quickly as it began it ended. He pulled back, his expression unreadable, caught between want and guilt. "I'm sorry," he whispered, standing. I was still crouched on the floor, breathless and stunned.
"Don't be."
The words escaped before I could stop them. He offered me his hand to help me up, and I took it. His touch felt steady, but mine trembled. We exchanged no further words as we left the gym, but something between us was irreversibly changed. The drive home from the gym was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel, but my thoughts were spinning in a million directions.
I
Replayed the moment over and over, his touch, the feel of his breath, the warmth of his lips.
I
Kept telling myself it was just a lapse in judgment, a fleeting moment of weakness. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, the memory settled deep inside me, like a spark, smoldering in the dark. The house was quiet when I arrived. I could hear the hum of the fridge, the faint creak of the floorboards under my feet. I set my bag down and took a deep breath. I had to pull myself together. When my husband came home, I needed to be normal. By the time he walked through the door, I was already busy in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with a precision that bordered on obsessive. "Smells good," he said, wrapping his arms around my waist. His embrace was familiar, solid. "And yet, long day," I asked, forcing my voice to sound casual. He sighed and rested his chin on my shoulder. "You could say that." I nodded and kept chopping though my pulse raced. His touch should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt like a reminder of everything I was trying to suppress. We sat down to dinner, and he talked about work, upcoming plans, and his idea for a weekend trip to the mountains. I smiled and nodded in the right places, but the thought of the weekend together made something tighten in my chest. "Doesn't that sound perfect?" he asked, his eyes warm, hopeful. I hesitated, the truth clawing at the back of my throat. I felt like I was balancing on the edge of a blade. "It sounds great," I lied, my fork trembling in my hand. He reached across the table and squeezed my fingers gently. "We need this." I forced a smile, though the guilt was like a stone in my stomach. "Yeah, we do." The next morning, I avoided the kitchen entirely. I knew he'd be there. Instead, I grabbed my things and left early, telling myself that I needed to clear my head. I drove aimlessly for a while, winding through streets lined with houses that all looked the same, perfect little lives tucked behind white picket fences. But no amount of driving could shake the lingering memory of yesterday. I felt like I was unraveling by the second. When I finally pulled into the driveway, his car wasn't
there.
Relief washed over me. I stepped inside, kicked off my shoes, and let out a long, shuddering breath. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard the door open. "You're back early," his voice called out from below. I froze, hand resting on the banister. I turned slowly, forcing a neutral expression. He stood there, keys in hand, an unreadable look on his face. "Yeah," I replied, swallowing hard. "Just needed to be home." He nodded but didn't move, as if weighing whether to say more. There it was again, that quiet tension thick enough to choke on. I clung to the banister, willing myself to break it, to speak first. But he did. "Are you avoiding me?" he asked, his tone gentle but laced with something else. I blinked, caught off guard.
No.
"Why would you think that?" He gave a half smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Just a feeling." I felt exposed, as though he could see the chaos brewing beneath my calm exterior. But instead of pushing further, he took a step back, slipping the keys into his pocket. "I'll be outside if you need me." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone again. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The truth was gnawing at me from the inside. I wanted to believe I could resist, that I could put this behind me and pretend everything was fine, but pretending wasn't enough anymore. I didn't know why I agreed to the walk in the park. Maybe it was the way he asked casually, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Or maybe I wanted an excuse to be somewhere that didn't feel suffocating. The air outside was cool but not cold, and the sounds of the city softened as we reached the tree-lined path.
We
Walked side by side, speaking at first about mundane things, work routines, old memories. But soon the conversation shifted. "I remember when you used to laugh more," he said quietly, "watching a family of ducks pass by the pond." I raised an eyebrow. "You sound like someone who thinks he knows everything." "I don't, but I notice things." His gaze met mine, steady and unguarded. The weight of his words pressed down on me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I tried to deflect. "Let me guess, you're the insightful type?" He chuckled softly. "Maybe. Or maybe I just remember the way you were before all this." I looked away, unsure how to respond. He had seen parts of me that felt distant now, memories I didn't dare revisit too often. We continued walking until the soft hum of city noise returned. I felt a strange pull to hold on to the quiet between us, but the world was already creeping back in. We reached the edge of the park, and I stopped in my tracks. "I should head home," I said, though I wasn't sure if I wanted to leave. He hesitated for a second. His face conflicted, but then he nodded. "All right, I'll walk you back." The streets were dimly lit, the air thick with the sounds of life winding down. The closer we got to my house, the more I felt the tension tightening between us. We reached the front steps, and he lingered for a moment, looking as though he had more to say. I gave him a small nod before stepping inside, and as soon as the door closed behind me, the weight of the day hit me all at once. I wasn't ready to face my husband yet, not with the guilt and longing tangled together inside me. Flash forward. After the evening gathering, the evening had stretched long, filled with polite conversations and clinking glasses that blurred together. By the time I left, I felt the strain in my legs from dancing too much in heels that weren't made for walking. I stumbled slightly as I made my way up the sidewalk, the cool night air pressing against my skin. Everything around me seemed softened, almost dreamlike. The distant hum of music still played in my ears, and I caught myself smiling at the absurdity of it all. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the warmth of home enveloped me, a stark contrast to the cool night outside. The familiar scent of wood polish and fresh linen settled around me like a comforting hug. There he was, seated calmly on the couch, one arm draped casually over the side. His gaze flicked to me, and he raised an eyebrow. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice carrying a quiet humor. I let out a tired laugh and shrugged off my jacket, letting it fall to the floor. My body was aching, and my head was buzzing with the remnants of the night. Instead of picking up the jacket, I flopped onto the couch, letting my legs dangle off the side. "You have no idea," I murmured, pressing the back of my hand to my forehead. The world felt thick and slow, like wading through water. I was on the verge of laughter from how ridiculous I felt. He stood up and grabbed the throw blanket from the back of the chair. Without a word, he draped it over me, tucking the edges carefully around my legs. Then he disappeared briefly into the kitchen and returned with a glass of water. I blinked up at him, my eyes half closed. "You're being suspiciously nice." He smirked. "Don't get used to it." I mumbled something incoherent in response. He chuckled, shook his head, and headed back to the kitchen, leaving me wrapped in warmth and silence. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and toasted bread. I blinked against the sunlight filtering in through the window. The glass of water sat neatly on the coffee table, and my jacket was folded and draped over the back of the chair. I stretched, my body still heavy with sleep, and made my way to the kitchen. He stood there, flipping toast on the pan like he did it every day of his life. "Good morning," he said without turning. "Morning," I replied, still groggy. I leaned against the counter, watching him. He moved with a calm efficiency, as though he thrived in chaos rather than avoided it. I thought about the previous night, the simple gestures, the way he'd looked at me like I wasn't a mess but just human. It could have been the kind of story people like to dramatize to make into something it wasn't, but it wasn't that. It was just kindness, wrapped in a little humor and a strange sort of understanding, but that didn't make it any less complicated. I should have known things wouldn't stay simple. No matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, the current that pulled me toward him was too strong to ignore. The day was quiet. My husband had gone to run errands, leaving me alone in the house. I told myself I'd use the time to clear my head, to sort through the tangle of emotions that had only gotten messier. Instead, I wandered aimlessly from room to room, my thoughts circling back to him. I had just settled onto the couch with a book when the door creaked open. My breath caught. He stepped inside, holding a bag of groceries. "Your husband asked me to drop these off. He thought you might need help with dinner." I stared at the bag, as if it was something foreign. "He didn't tell me you were coming." He set the bag on the kitchen counter and leaned against it casually, as though he belonged there. "Maybe he wanted to surprise you." I closed the book, my heart thudding in my chest.
That
Sounds like him. The silence between us stretched thin. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my dress with trembling hands. "I can manage from here," I said softly, more to convince myself than him. But he didn't move. His eyes held mine unwavering. "Do you really want me to leave?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no sound came. Without thinking, I stepped toward the counter, brushing past him as I reached for the groceries. The space between us became almost non-existent. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the faint scent of fresh air lingering on him. My fingers fumbled with the bag, and before I could stop it, I slipped out and rolled across the floor. We both bent to grab it, and that's when it happened. It wasn't like the first time, hesitant and fleeting. This time our movements collided in a way that felt inevitable. His hand covered mine and I didn't pull away. I couldn't. His touch was steady, but beneath it, I could feel the same trembling I felt inside myself.
I
Looked up, and the moment stretched suspended in time. Why does this feel so wrong and right? At the same time, I whispered almost to myself. He let out a slow breath, his forehead resting briefly against mine. "Because it's both." And then, as if we'd both stopped resisting the gravity pulling us together, his lips found mine. This time there was no hesitation. The kiss was slow, deliberate, like an unspoken confession. The sound of the front door opening shattered everything. I pushed him back instinctively, my heart in my throat. My husband's voice carried through the
hall.
"I'm back." Forgot my wallet. I stepped away, wiping my hands on my dress, as if that could erase the moment.
He picked up the fallen can.
His movements calm despite the storm of emotions swirling around us. My husband appeared in the doorway, cheerful and oblivious.
"Hey,
"Didn't know you were here," he said, clapping him on the shoulder. He smiled back, as composed as ever. "Just dropped off the groceries." My husband glanced at me, his brow furrowing slightly. "You okay?" I forced a smile, my pulse racing. "Yeah, just there." My husband kissed my forehead, absent-mindedly, grabbed his wallet, and left just as quickly as he'd come. The silence that followed was deafening.
He turned to me,
his expression a mixture of guilt and longing. "This can't happen again," I whispered, though the words felt like a lie even as I said them.
He
took a step back, nodding slowly. "I know," but neither of us moved. The distance between us felt like a fragile thread, ready to snap at the slightest pull. The door closed again, signaling that my husband was gone for good this time. And yet, all I could think about was how close I had come to losing everything, and how terrifyingly easy it had been to let it happen. The hours after he left felt hollow, like echoes in an empty room. I wandered from the kitchen to the living room, unsure what to do with myself. My mind was a mess, a storm of fear, guilt, and something I hated admitting, longing. By the time evening rolled around, my husband suggested we spend the night together. Dinner. A quiet movie, just the two of us. He was trying in his way to reach me. I saw it in the way he looked at me, as if sensing that I was slipping away, but unsure why.
I
Agreed, forcing a smile that felt paper-thin. We ordered takeout, set it on the coffee table, and settled onto the couch. The room was dim, lit only by the flicker of the TV. His arm draped over my shoulder, familiar and steady. But instead of comfort, it felt like a weight, a reminder of how far I'd drifted from the person I used to be. He paused the movie halfway through and turned to me. "Are we okay?" His voice was quiet, uncertain. My throat tightened. I felt the urge to tell him everything, to spill the truth and let the chips fall where they may.
but
The words wouldn't come. Instead, I said, "I'm just tired." He studied my face for a long moment, his brows drawn together in quiet concern. "We've been
distant.
I thought maybe a weekend away could help." There was again his answer to everything. A plan, a solution, a way to fix things. I nodded, though the idea of being alone with him in some remote cabin made me feel trapped rather than safe. "Yeah, maybe," I whispered. His hand found mine and squeezed gently. "I love you. You know that, right?" I nodded again, but the words felt hollow. "I know." The next morning I woke before dawn, the weight of his arm draped across my waist. His breathing was slow and steady, the way it always was when he was deep in sleep. I slipped out of bed carefully, padding across the floor to the bathroom. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, staring at my reflection in the mirror. Dark circles rimmed my eyes, and there was a tiredness in my face that makeup couldn't hide. I barely recognized myself anymore. The hum of my phone on the counter broke the silence.
I
Picked it up, and my heart jolted at the name on the screen. Him. A single text. "We need to talk. I can't stay here anymore." I felt my chest tighten. Part of me knew this was inevitable. He wasn't built for secrets, for lies. And yet, the thought of him leaving sent a wave of panic through me. I typed back, fingers trembling. "Meet me later. I'll explain everything." By mid-morning, I was walking home from a quick errand trying to clear my mind. But I still felt unsteady, as if I'd been walking a tightrope for too long. The autumn breeze tugged at my hair, and my heels clicked softly against the pavement. I saw the familiar outline of her house in the distance. My feet felt heavier with every step. By the time I reached the door and stepped inside, exhaustion washed over me like a wave. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air. And then I saw him, leaning against the counter, pouring a second cup. He wasn't supposed to be here. "You're here early," I said, closing the door behind me. He looked up, his expression tense. "I told you. I can't keep doing this." I nodded, my throat dry. "I know." He set the coffee pot down with a quiet thud. "I'm leaving today." The words hit like a punch. "Leaving? Where?" "Back home," he replied simply. "I need space." "And so do you." The room spun slightly, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Please don't make this harder," I whispered. He took a step forward, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him. "You have to decide," he said quietly. "Because if I stay, it's only going to get worse." Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back. I had spent so long telling myself I could balance it all, that I could have this. Whatever this was, without losing everything. But now it felt like the pieces were slipping through my fingers. "I can't." My voice broke before I could finish. He reached out, brushing a tear from my cheek with his thumb. "You can." He leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. The kind of kiss that felt like both a goodbye and a promise. And then he stepped back, grabbed his bag, and walked to the door. I stood there, frozen as the door closed behind him. The silence that followed was unbearable. It was the kind of quiet that came after something broke. An absence you couldn't fix. I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands. The sound of my husband's car pulling into the driveway shook me from my thoughts. I wiped my face quickly, plastering on a neutral expression. He stepped inside, greeting me with a warm smile. "You okay?" I nodded, the lie coming more easily than I thought it would. "Yeah, just there." But as I watched him take off his coat and settle into his usual rhythm, I realized something terrifying. I hadn't chosen him because I loved him more. I'd chosen him because it was easier. And somehow that felt like the cruelest betrayal of all. The house felt heavier after he left, like the silence had settled into the walls themselves. I sat on the couch staring at nothing, my mind running in circles. Every part of me wanted to believe that things could go back to normal, that I could breathe again without the weight of guilt pressing down on my chest. But the truth clung to me like damp clothes. You can't outrun your choices. By the time my husband returned, the house was filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and the sound of soft music. I had thrown myself into the routine of cleaning and organizing, desperate to feel like I had control over something. He kissed me on the cheek as he set down his briefcase. "You've been busy." I forced a smile. Thought it was time to declutter. He glanced at the perfectly arranged shelves, the spotless countertops. "Are you okay?" His voice was soft, searching. I nodded, even as my heart ached. "I am." But the lie tasted bitter. Days passed, and the rhythm of life slowly settled back into place. My husband talked about plans for the weekend, about upcoming events at work, about little things that I barely registered. I responded when I had to, played my part well enough that he didn't ask too many questions. But every night, when the lights went out and the house grew quiet, I felt the absence like an open wound. I thought I could bury it. I thought I could lock the memories away. But they haunted me in the small, quiet moments. The smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of laughter on the street, the way the sky turned golden at sunset. Everything reminded me of him. One afternoon, I found myself wandering through the park, the same one where we had walked together. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant bonfires. I sat on a bench near the pond, watching the ripples spread out over the surface. A group of children fed breadcrumbs to the ducks, their laughter ringing out like bells. I closed my eyes, letting the sounds wrap around me. For a brief moment, I could almost hear his voice, low and warm, teasing me about something trivial. When I opened my eyes, I saw a folded piece of paper tucked beneath a rock on the edge of the bench. My pulse quickened as I reached for it, my fingers trembling slightly. It was his handwriting, neat slanted letters that I knew too well. "I hope you find what you're looking for." I stared at the note, my heart caught between aching and gratitude. He was gone, but he had left something behind. An understanding, a reminder that our lives had crossed for a reason, even if it wasn't meant to last. The breeze picked up, tugging the paper from my fingers. I watched it drift away until it was lost among the trees. When I returned home that evening, my husband was in the kitchen, humming as he prepared dinner. The scene was so familiar, so ordinary, that for a moment I just stood in the doorway watching him. He turned and smiled when he noticed me. "You're home." I nodded and stepped closer. "Yeah, I'm home." But even as I said it, I knew that part of me would never be entirely home again. We sat at the table talking about nothing and everything. He reached across and took my hand, his thumb brushing over my knuckles in a way that once felt comforting. I smiled back, but something inside me stayed silent. I had made my choice, but it didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning of a life I would have to learn how to live, where happiness was something I had to create, not something handed to me. As the night wore on, I let myself lean into the quiet, into the moments that felt
Real.
But when I lay down to sleep that night, I couldn't help but wonder if he was somewhere out there, watching the same sky, feeling the same ache. Life would go on. It always does. But some stories leave echoes that never quite fade.